The weight of a legacy is heavier than the fortune that builds it. Arthur Pembroke, at 72, felt that weight in the marrow of his bones. It was a phantom limb, an ache where his wife, Eleanor, used to be. She had been the soul of Pembroke Industries, the quiet conscience that guided his ambition. Now, with her gone 2 years, he feared the soul was leaking out of his empire, replaced by the sterile hum of profit margins and shareholder reports. Tonight, he was not Arthur Pembroke, the titan of pharmaceuticals and biotech, whose name was etched onto university halls and hospital wings. Tonight, he was all, a retired history teacher from Toledo, adrift in the neon canyons of New York City. His disguise was a study in beige anonymity, a worn tweed jacket from a Greenwich Village thrift shop, pleated trousers that had been fashionable during the Reagan administration, and scuffed leather shoes that sighed with every step. A pair of thick, bifocal glasses and a 2-day stubble of silver whiskers completed the illusion. He saw his reflection in the darkened window of a taxi. Not a billionaire, but a man contemplating the dwindling balance of his Social Security check. The invisibility was a bitter comfort. His destination was Ethelgard, the crown jewel of his hospitality division. Perched atop a skyscraper in Midtown, it was a temple of modern gastronomy, a place where a single tasting menu cost more than a month's rent for the woman who polished its silver. Arthur had acquired the restaurant group a year ago, a diversification Eleanor had championed, believing that hospitality, at its best, was an act of grace. The reports from his COO, a sharp-edged young man named Donovan, painted a picture of flawless execution and record profits. But spreadsheets couldn't measure grace. Arthur needed to feel the place through the eyes of a man who didn't merit a second glance. The private elevator opened into a hushed world of muted greys and polished obsidian. The air smelled of money, seared scallops, and a faint floral perfume that seemed to be atomized directly into the ventilation system. A hostess, a woman so impossibly sleek she looked as if she'd been sculpted from marble, appraised his attire with a glance that was as swift as it was surgical. "May I help you?" Her voice was a melody of polite dismissal. "Table for one, please," Arthur said, adding a slight, apologetic rasp to his voice. She tapped a stylus against a tablet, her brow furrowed in a performance of deep concentration. "We are fully committed this evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" "No, I'm afraid not." "Just in town for the night?" "I see." The 2 words carried a universe of meaning. "You don't belong here." "The only table I might have is by the service corridor. I'm afraid it has a rather active view of the kitchen entrance." It was the classic exiles table, a social Siberia for the sartorially challenged. "That would be just fine," Arthur said, playing his part. "Thank you." He followed her through the main dining room, a constellation of quiet conversations and the soft clinking of cutlery. He felt the subtle shift in atmosphere as he passed, the brief, curious stares that quickly turned away. He was a discordant note in a carefully composed symphony, a smudge on a pristine canvas. He was seated at a small, isolated table, just as promised. The swinging doors to the kitchen provided a relentless percussion of thwump hiss, accompanied by the muffled staccato of shouted orders. It was the worst seat in the house. It was perfect. From here, he could observe the restaurant's inner workings. He saw the ballet of the servers, their smiles brightening or dimming in direct proportion to the perceived value of their tables. He saw the manager, a man in a razor-sharp suit with a predatory stillness, moving between tables. Arthur recognized him from the acquisition files, Marcus Thorne. Thorne possessed a chillingly smooth charm, but his eyes were like a shark's, black, depthless, and constantly moving. He placed a hand on the shoulder of a wealthy patron, laughing at a joke. But the moment he turned, the smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of cold command as he snapped his fingers at a busboy. Arthur settled in, a ghost at the feast. He was invisible, and from this invisibility he could finally see. He saw the transactional nature of the kindness, the carefully rehearsed deference. It was a magnificent machine, efficient and profitable. But Eleanor would have hated it. It had no soul. He had been nursing a glass of tap water for nearly 15 minutes when a waitress finally approached. She was different from the others. Where they were polished and detached, she seemed present. She was young, maybe 21 or 22, with serious, intelligent green eyes and dark hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. Her uniform was immaculate, but the cuffs of her white shirt were frayed just enough to betray countless washings. What struck him most was the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she set down a menu. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of a deep and abiding exhaustion her polite smile couldn't erase. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My name is Elara. I'll be your server tonight. May I get you something to drink?" He looked at her name tag. Elara. It was an unusual, elegant name. He deliberately ordered the least expensive glass of wine on the list, a simple Pinot Grigio. He watched for the flicker of disappointment, the subtle sigh that would betray her judgment. He saw nothing. "Of course," she said with the same steady, respectful tone. "I'll be right back with that." As she walked away, he noticed her shoes, standard-issue black non-slips, but the soles were worn thin, the leather creased and cracked. They were the shoes of someone who lived on her feet, someone for whom a new $80 pair was a significant, perhaps impossible, expense. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes more than Donovan's profit and loss statements. For the first time all night, Arthur Pembroke felt a flicker of genuine human connection. Who was this young woman, Elara, who looked at a man in a thrift store jacket and saw not a liability, but simply a person? He didn't know it yet, but his melancholic test was about to intersect with a desperate, secret investigation. And this quiet waitress with the tired eyes and worn-out shoes was about to hand him a clue that would threaten to shatter the very foundation of his company and everything he thought he'd built. Elara Thorne moved through the rarefied air of Ethelgard with the practiced economy of a survivor. The restaurant was a stage, and she was a master of her role, the attentive, knowledgeable, yet unobtrusive server. But behind the curtain of her professional calm, a quiet, desperate war was being waged. Her world had shrunk to the size of a hospital room, to the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the strained breathing of her younger brother, Leo. At 18, Leo should have been agonizing over college essays. Instead, he was fighting a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. A new experimental treatment offered a sliver of hope, but it was financially ruinous, a black hole that devoured every dollar Elara earned. Their parents were gone, lost in a car accident 5 years prior, leaving Elara as Leo's sole guardian and provider. The job at Ethelgard was a lifeline, the best-paying service job in the city, but it came with its own poison. The poison was Marcus Thorne. The manager wasn't just a demanding boss, he was a meticulous predator. He knew about Leo. He knew about the crushing medical debt. And he used it. He had a way of scheduling her for grueling back-to-back shifts, of finding fault in her work where none existed, of reminding her, with a chillingly paternal smile, how many other girls would kill for her job. He owned her, and they both knew it. But her fear of Marcus was secondary to a newer, more terrifying suspicion that had taken root in her mind over the past few months. It had started with small, disconnected observations. Elara had a peculiar gift, a legacy from her father, who had been a research chemist. She had his nose and his eye for detail. She could identify the chemical components in perfumes, the subtle notes of oxidation in a wine, the precise reason a floral arrangement was wilting on one side of the room, a draught from a nearby vent. It was this gift that made her notice the Elysian truffle oil. It was a new, off-menu item that Marcus himself would present, with great ceremony, to only a select few tables, always wealthy, older men, often titans of industry or finance. He would anoint their steaks or risottos with the oil from a small, unmarked crystal cruet he kept in his office. But Elara, clearing the plates, noticed a strange, faint smell beneath the earthy aroma of truffle. It was a sharp, almost antiseptic scent, one she vaguely recognized from flipping through her father's old textbooks on organic compounds. Then she began to notice a pattern in the patrons. A recurring guest, a banking CEO, had developed a slight tremor in his hand over several visits. Another, a real estate mogul, often complained of a mild, persistent headache after his meal. They were small things, easily dismissed as the vagaries of age or stress. But to Elara, they formed a constellation of dread. She had started keeping a small, coded notebook, marking the dates, the table numbers, and the subtle symptoms she observed. It was a crazy theory, born of stress and paranoia, she told herself. But she couldn't shake it. When she first saw the old man in the tweed jacket at table 17, her instinct was one of protective sympathy. It was the worst table, a place Marcus reserved for tourists and walk-ins he deemed unworthy. The other servers would ignore him, lavishing their attention on the tables where the promise of a 3-figure tip gleamed. Elara couldn't do that. Her father had taught her that chemistry wasn't just about formulas, it was about observing the world with precision and without prejudice. She treated people the same way. She approached him with the same quiet respect she offered the hedge fund manager at table 5. When he ordered the cheapest wine, she simply nodded and smiled. It was a small rebellion against the restaurant's unspoken caste system. As she worked, she kept an eye on him. He wasn't fiddling with a phone or trying to catch anyone's attention. He was just watching, his gaze sweeping the room with a calm, unnerving intelligence. He seemed less like a man out of his depth and more like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. When she returned to take his food order, she steeled herself. "Have you had a chance to decide, sir?" He looked up from the menu, his eyes meeting hers over the top of his bifocals. "Yes. I believe I'll have the Emperor's cut." Elara's professional mask nearly fractured. The Emperor's cut was a $600 monument to excess, a 50-ounce slab of Wagyu beef dry-aged for 100 days. It was a meal ordered for Instagram, for bravado, for corporate expense accounts. It was not something a retired teacher from Toledo ordered. Ever. Her mind raced. Was he mentally unwell? Was this some kind of prank for a YouTube channel? Marcus would have her fired on the spot if this man couldn't pay. She had a choice. She could gently question him, guide him toward a more appropriate selection. That's what Marcus would expect. But then she looked into his eyes again. There was no delusion there, no foolish pride. There was only a quiet, unwavering calm. It felt like a test. And in that moment, Elara made a decision rooted in her father's teachings. Observe, don't assume. She would treat his request with dignity. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, her voice perfectly even. "And how would you like that prepared?" "Medium rare," he replied, his gaze steady. and a glass of the Chateau Margaux, 1982, to accompany it. Now she was truly staggering. The Margaux was over $3,000 a bottle. A single glass was 500 Russells. This diner, at the worst table in the house, was about to run up a bill that was more than her entire monthly paycheck. Her training screamed at her to fetch the manager, to ask for a credit card up front. But her gut, and a strange sense of kinship with this quiet, observant man, told her to trust him. "Right away, sir," she said, her voice betraying none of her internal chaos. She walked away, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could feel Marcus's eyes on her from across the room. She entered the order into the terminal, her fingers trembling. The system, programmed for such eventualities, automatically sent a high-value alert to the manager's tablet. She knew he was coming. As expected, Marcus intercepted her near the sommelier station, his body blocking her path like a fallen tree. "Thorne," he hissed, foregoing her first name, as he always did when he was angry. "What in God's name are you doing? Table 17 just ordered the Emperor's and a glass of the 82 Margaux. Yes, Mr. Thorne, I just put the order in." "Are you an idiot?" His face was flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. "Look at him. He looks like he gets his suits from a museum. You didn't get a card from him first?" "He didn't seem like the kind of man who would order something he couldn't afford, sir," Ilara said, keeping her voice low and respectful. "I didn't want to insult a guest." "Insult a guest?" Marcus scoffed, his voice a venomous whisper. "He's insulting us with his presence. When he dines and dashes, that $1,100 tab is coming out of your paychecks. You understand me? Every last cent." He leaned in closer, his cologne cloying and sharp. "You're already on thin ice with me, girl. Don't make me break it." The threat was explicit, a cold knife twisting in her gut. If this man couldn't pay, she would be ruined. The debt Marcus held over her would become a chasm. She would lose her job, and Leo would lose his only hope. But as she looked past Marcus's sneering face toward table 17, she saw the old man watching them. He couldn't hear their words, but he could read the dynamic plain as day. He saw Marcus's aggression and her fear, and he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a tiny gesture, but it sent a jolt of courage through her. He knew. He saw her. In that moment, she felt less alone. "I understand, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will take full responsibility." Marcus glared at her for another long moment, then spun on his heel and stalked away. Ilara took a deep, shaky breath and proceeded to the temperature-controlled wine cellar. She retrieved the legendary vintage, her movements precise and careful. When she presented and poured the wine at the table, her hands were rock steady. "Your Chateau Margaux, sir." He lifted the glass, swirling the deep garnet liquid. He didn't taste it immediately. Instead, he looked at her. "Is everything all right, Ilara?" Your manager seemed concerned. "Everything is fine, sir," she lied, the professional mask snapping back into place. "He's just very meticulous about the guest experience." The man took a slow sip of wine, his eyes closing for a moment as he savored it. When they opened again, they were fixed on her. "I suspect," he said, his voice low and resonant, "that your standards of care are far higher than his." Ilara's breath hitched. He saw right through her. He saw the lie, the fear, the struggle. He saw her. For the rest of his meal, an unspoken conversation flowed between them. He ate his steak with a slow, deliberate appreciation. He asked her about the city, but not like a tourist. He asked about the changing neighborhoods, the libraries, the quiet parks. He listened, truly listened, to her answers. For an hour, he made her feel like a person, not a servant. And as she watched him, a wild, terrifying and audacious idea began to crystallize in her mind. This man was not what he seemed. There was a power in his stillness, a depth in his quiet observation. He was a man who understood the world on a different level. Maybe, just maybe, he was the only person who would understand her insane theory. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. But as she saw Marcus approach another table of wealthy older men, the crystal cruet of Elysian oil in his hand, she knew she had no choice. She had to take the risk. She had to find a way to pass him a message. The dinner service surged around Ilara, a relentless tide of orders and requests, but she moved through it in a state of hyper-awareness. Her body performed the familiar tasks on autopilot, clearing plates, refilling glasses, describing the dessert specials, while her mind was a whirlwind of frantic calculation. The old man at table 17, her mysterious, unassuming guest, was finishing his espresso. Her window of opportunity was closing. Each time she approached his table, she felt his watchful eyes on her. It wasn't the leering gaze she sometimes endured from other patrons. It was analytical, patient. He was waiting for something, she realized. He was giving her space. Her plan was terrifyingly simple, the execution fraught with peril. She couldn't speak to him directly. Marcus had eyes everywhere, and the other staff were conditioned to report any unusual interactions. The note was her only chance, a silent scream for help. But what to write? "Help me, my boss is a monster." Sounded childish. "He's poisoning people" sounded insane. No, it had to be precise. It had to be scientific. It had to be something that would intrigue a man like him, a man who listened and observed. She thought of her father's journals, filled with chemical structures and arcane notations. One compound had stuck in her memory because of its unusual properties, a synthetic urea derivative her father had been studying for its neurological effects. The faint, sharp smell from the Elysian oil was a ghost of the scent she remembered from a contaminated sample in his lab. It was a long shot, a connection forged from grief and desperation, but it was all she had. During a brief lull, she ducked into the staff locker room, a cramped, fluorescent-lit space that smelled of anxiety and disinfectant. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tore a small, clean page from her coded notebook. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely grip the pen. She took a deep breath, picturing the old man's calm, steady eyes. She needed to be concise, factual, and alarming. She needed to give him a breadcrumb that only a certain kind of person could follow. She scribbled 4 short lines, her handwriting tight and hurried. "They are not watching you. The Elysian oil is a lie. Check lot 7B4, phenylacetylurea. He knows about my brother." The first line was a calculated risk, a way to tell him that his disguise was irrelevant. The danger was real and systemic. The second was the direct accusation. The third was the key, the specific lot number she'd glimpsed on a crate in the kitchen, and the chemical name, a piece of technical jargon that would either be dismissed as nonsense or recognized as a catastrophic red flag. The final line was her desperate admission of vulnerability, the reason she couldn't go to the police. It was proof of her coercion. She didn't sign it. The note had to be a whisper from a ghost. She folded the small piece of paper into a tiny, tight square and tucked it deep into her apron pocket. It felt like a miniature bomb against her thigh. Her shift was almost over. The man had paid his bill, in cash. He'd left the exact amount, $1,187.42, including tax on the small leather billfold. Another strange detail: no credit card meant no paper trail. The precise amount, not rounded up for a tip, was a signal. It was the act of someone making a specific point. He was waiting. As she returned to his table for the final clearing, the ambient sound of the restaurant seemed to fade away, replaced by the roaring of blood in her ears. Marcus was at the host stand, his back to her. This was it. "Will there be anything else for you this evening, sir?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "No, thank you, Elara. The meal was unforgettable," he said. His eyes, however, said something more. They were focused, expectant. "I'm so glad you enjoyed it." With movements honed by 1,000 shifts, she began to clear the espresso cup and water glass. Her hands were a blur of professional efficiency. As her right hand collected the billfold, her left, shielded from the room by her body, slipped the folded note from her pocket and placed it on the table, immediately covering it with the small silver tray she was also clearing. The entire exchange took less than a second, a piece of desperate sleight of hand. She picked up the tray, the note now hidden beneath it, and turned to leave. "Wait." The man's voice was quiet, but it sliced through the room's murmur and stopped her cold. Elara froze, her back to him. Her blood turned to ice. "He saw me. He's going to expose me." It was all a game. A wave of vertiginous panic washed over her. Slowly she turned to face him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the empty spot on the table where the silver tray had been. He had seen her place the note, and he had seen her pick it back up, hidden under the tray. He had expected her to leave it behind. In her fear, she had been too clever. She had hidden it so well, he thought she had reconsidered and taken it back. His eyes lifted to meet hers. There was no anger in them, only a profound confusion and a flicker of deep disappointment. Elara's mind reeled. She had failed. Her one chance, squandered by her own trembling hands. She stood there, trapped in the spotlight of his gaze, the damning note burning a hole through the tray she held. She had to fix this. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like fire, she walked back to the table. Her movements were stiff, robotic. She could feel Marcus's attention shift, his conversation pausing. He was watching her now. She reached the table and, without a word, tilted the tray just enough for the tiny white square of paper to slide off and land silently on the dark wood. She didn't look at the man. She couldn't. She simply placed the billfold back down on top of the note, this time leaving it for him. "You forgot this," she whispered, the words barely audible. "For your records." It was a nonsensical excuse, but it was all she could muster. She turned and walked away, not running, but moving with a speed that defied the room's languid pace. She didn't look back. She felt as if she had just lit the fuse on a bomb and was now simply waiting for the explosion. Arthur Pembroke watched her hasty retreat, his mind a maelstrom of confusion, pity, and sudden, chilling clarity. He had seen the entire clumsy ballet, the initial slip, the panicked retrieval, and the final, desperate deposit. Her whispered words, "For your records," were absurd. The note was the record. The information was the currency. He waited until she had vanished through the swinging kitchen doors. He glanced toward the manager, Thorne, who was now staring at his table with undisguised suspicion. The charade was over. Arthur casually placed his hand over the leather billfold, his fingers closing around the hidden paper. The texture was crisp, folded. He stood, pulling on his worn tweed jacket. He gave Thorne a slight, vacant nod, the kind an old man gives to a figure of authority he doesn't wish to engage. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator. Once outside, the cool, damp night air of Manhattan felt like a slap. The city's cacophony, the blare of horns, the wail of a distant siren, was a welcome intrusion after the restaurant's suffocating silence. His heart was pounding with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't Arthur Pembroke, grieving widower. He was the founder of a pharmaceutical giant, and someone had just handed him a note with a chemical compound on it. He ducked into the shadows of an adjacent building's portico and unfolded the tiny square of paper. The hastily scribbled words seemed to vibrate under the glow of a street lamp. They are not watching you. The Elysian oil is a lie. Check lot, Yaru 7B4, phenylacetolurea. He knows about my brother. Arthur read it once, then twice, the blood draining from his face. Phenylacetolurea. It wasn't a common chemical. It was a precursor, a building block used in the synthesis of certain anticonvulsant and sedative drugs. Specifically, it was related to the phenobarbital family. It had no place in a kitchen, let alone in a truffle oil served to his customers. The note wasn't a disgruntled employee's rant. It wasn't a plea for cash. It was a precise, terrifying, and unbelievably specific accusation. Poisoning wasn't a metaphor. It was a diagnosis. His simple test for the soul of his company had uncovered a potential horror story. The quiet waitress with the frayed cuffs and haunted eyes hadn't just served him a meal. She had handed him a ticking time bomb, a mystery that stopped him cold and threatened to bring his entire legacy, the one he had built to honor Eleanor, crashing down in a storm of litigation and public revulsion. He looked back up at the glittering lights of Ethelgard. It no longer looked like a restaurant. It looked like a laboratory, and he was its unwitting owner. The city air, thick with the metallic tang of imminent rain, did little to cool the fire in Arthur's veins. The small, folded note in his pocket felt radioactive. His melancholic quest for his company's soul had metastasized into a corporate crisis of terrifying proportions. The tired, grieving old man was gone, replaced by the ruthless, methodical strategist who had built a global pharmaceutical empire on a foundation of unassailable data and swift, decisive action. He walked for 10 blocks, the rhythm of his steps a metronome for his racing thoughts. Phenylacetolurea. The name echoed in his mind. It was an obscure choice, not something a layperson would know. This waitress, Elara, was either a brilliant fabulist or she knew exactly what she was talking about. He knows about my brother. That was the key to her desperation, the reason she'd risk everything on a stranger in a cheap coat. She was trapped. He found a quiet, old-fashioned hotel bar, all dark wood and worn leather, and took a secluded booth. He pulled out a sleek, encrypted satellite phone he carried only for emergencies. He had one number on speed dial. It rang once before a crisp, no-nonsense voice answered. Evelyn. Evelyn Reed had been his head of security for 30 years. A former MI6 agent with eyes that missed nothing, she was the keeper of his secrets and the executor of his will, both corporate and personal. She was the only person besides himself who had full access to the Pembroke Ghost Network, a team of independent investigators, forensic accountants, and ethical hackers he used for sensitive due diligence. Evelyn, it's me. I have a situation. Code Eleanor. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Code Eleanor was their highest alert, reserved for existential threats to the company or his family. It hadn't been used since an attempted hostile takeover a decade ago. Understood, Arthur. Where are you? Are you secure? I'm secure. The problem is at Ethelgard in New York. In low, clipped tones, he recounted the evening. The disguise, the manager Marcus Thorne, the quiet waitress Elara, and the contents of the note. He read the 4 lines aloud. Evelyn didn't question or doubt. She processed. Phenylacetolurea, she repeated, her voice sharp, related to phenobarbital synthesis, unregulated, but its presence is anomalous. Lot. Nausea 7 before. gives us a starting point. The brother gives us the motive for coercion. She was terrified, Evelyn. This Thorne character is a predator. Predators leave tracks, Evelyn said coldly. Donovan's reports on the restaurant group have been glowing. He called Thorne a rising star. Donovan sees profits. He doesn't see people, Arthur grumbled. I need to know who Thorne is. Everything. His history, his financials, any connection to chemical suppliers or research labs. I want a full workup by 0600. Use the Ghost network. No internal audit trails. Donovan is not to know. Not yet. Consider it done, Evelyn replied. What about the girl, Ilara? Find out everything about her, too. Her brother's condition, the hospital, the doctors, the debt. I need to understand the leverage he has on her. If she's telling the truth, she's the bravest person I've met in years. We have to protect her. And the oil? The note is useless without a sample to test. This was the crux of it. I need that oil, Evelyn. I need a sample from that lot number tonight, before Thorne has a chance to suspect anything and destroy the evidence. A surprise health inspection would be the legal route, Evelyn noted. No. Too slow, too public. Thorne would be tipped off. He was suspicious of me when I left. An official inspection would send him into lockdown. It has to be covert. It has to be tonight. A weary sigh travelled through the phone. You want me to break into your own restaurant? I want you to acquire a sample of a potentially hazardous substance from my property before it can harm anyone else, Arthur corrected her. You're the best, Evelyn. That's why I hired you. Flattery will get you everywhere, Arthur, she said dryly. But this is risky. The security system in that building is one of ours, state-of-the-art. Which means you know its weaknesses. Every system has a weakness, she conceded. I'll handle it myself. I'm 2 hours out of the city. I'll need access to the building's network schematics and the service elevator overrides. And I'll need a distraction. What kind of distraction? A minor one. A fire alarm in the adjacent building at 3 a.m. should pull the single overnight security guard away from his monitor for a few minutes. It's sloppy, but it's fast. I'll be in and out in under 10. Make it happen, Arthur said, a sense of grim momentum building. Send the sample to the private lab in Teterboro, full toxicology and mass spectrometry. I want results rushed, no matter the cost. I'm on it. Stay put. I'll contact you when I have the sample. Evelyn, Arthur added, his voice dropping. Be careful. I am always careful, Arthur, she replied. It's the guilty who get careless. The line went dead. The waiting was excruciating. Arthur sat in the dimly lit booth, the untouched glass of scotch in front of him, sweating in the cool air. He thought of Ilara's face, the deep-seated exhaustion, mixed with a fierce, quiet intelligence. She had gambled her entire world on a stranger, on the hope that someone, anyone, would listen. The weight of that trust settled upon him, heavier than his fortune, heavier even than his grief. It was the weight of responsibility, a feeling he hadn't truly shouldered since Eleanor's passing. At 3:05 a.m., his satellite phone buzzed. A single text from Evelyn. Package acquired. En route to lab. Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The first piece of the puzzle was in place. By sunrise, the reports began to flood his encrypted laptop. Evelyn's team had worked with silent, terrifying efficiency. The file on Marcus Thorne was a portrait of a brilliant but pathologically narcissistic man. He had been a promising research chemist at a rival pharmaceutical firm until he was fired for falsifying data in a clinical trial. He had been blacklisted from the industry, a pariah with a mountain of debt and a burning grudge against the entire pharmaceutical world, especially Pembroke Industries, which had exposed his fraud. The file on Ilara Thorne was a testament to quiet desperation, her parents' death, her dropping out of a promising chemistry program at Columbia to care for Leo. The mountain of medical bills was documented. The first call from the lab had been a clinical incision, laying bare the cold, factual horror of Marcus Thorne's enterprise. The subsequent calls from Evelyn Reed's ghost network were a slow, methodical autopsy of the man himself. By the time the grey dawn broke over the East River, painting the sky in bruised shades of lavender and steel, Arthur Pembroke knew everything. He saw the mountain of debt from failed ventures, the seething professional jealousy documented in old emails, the meticulously researched dossiers Thorne had compiled on his wealthy, aging victims. It was not a crime of passion or simple greed. It was a campaign, a quiet, patient act of biochemical terrorism waged against the world that had rejected him, funded by the very empire he despised. The fury that settled in Arthur's bones was not hot and explosive, but cold and dense, a singularity of purpose. For 2 years he had been adrift in the fog of grief, a custodian of Eleanor's memory rather than a champion of her ideals. He had managed the empire she helped build with a sense of weary obligation, signing checks, reviewing reports, a ghost haunting his own life. Now, the fog had been burned away by the harsh, clarifying light of pure evil. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a protector. The lives Thorne had tampered with, the trust he had violated, it had all happened under the Pembroke name. This was his failure. The reckoning would be his, and his alone. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, watching the city awaken. He was no longer Al, the history teacher from Toledo. He was Arthur Pembroke, and he was about to go to war. "Evelyn," he spoke into the secure line, his voice a low gravel. "The federal raid is off the table. It's too loud, too impersonal. It gives him a stage. I won't have it." Evelyn's voice was a calm counterpoint. "What's the alternative, Arthur? A quiet conversation with his lawyer? No. A performance review." A thin, mirthless smile touched his lips. "Thorne sees himself as a mastermind, a puppeteer. We're not going to cut the strings. We're going to let him see the real puppet master, and then we're going to burn the entire theater down around him. I'm going to the restaurant. Alone. That's inadvisable. I won't be alone. You'll have a team in place, unseen. But I will be the only one he sees. I want to be there when the curtain falls. I need to look him in the eye." He paused, the image of Ilara's terrified face flashing in his mind. "And I need to ensure the heroine of this story is kept safe from the fallout. Send a car for Ilara Thorne. I don't want her anywhere near that building today. Tell her it's a paid day off, a bonus for exceptional service. Tell her anything, just get her clear." "Understood," Evelyn said. "And Thorne?" "He arrives at 10 a.m. every day to accept deliveries. I'll be his first delivery of the day." The Aethel Guard. In the morning was a different creature entirely. Stripped of its clientele and its moody lighting, it was a cavern of polished surfaces and echoing silence. The air, usually thick with the scent of seared scallops and expensive perfume, smelled only of lemon polish and ozone. Arthur walked through the main doors as if he owned the place, which of course he did. Marcus Thorne was in his glass-walled office, overlooking the empty dining room, a cup of coffee in hand, a portrait of managerial command. He looked up, and for a moment his face registered only annoyance at the intrusion. Then recognition dawned, followed by a wave of confusion and dawning panic. The shabby old man from table 17 was gone. In his place stood Arthur Pembroke, his face a mask of cold granite, his bespoke suit a declaration of a power so vast it needed no announcement. Thorne shot to his feet, knocking his chair back. Mr. Pembroke, what an unexpected— Save it, Marcus, Arthur said, his voice quiet but filling the cavernous space. He walked calmly to the bar, running a hand over the cool marble countertop. I came to discuss a supply chain issue. A supply issue? Thorne stammered, his mind racing, trying to find a foothold in a conversation that was already quicksand. Yes, specifically, Lot Narsko 7B4. Arthur turned, his eyes locking onto Thorne's. The Elysian truffle oil. I'm a chemist by training, you know. Before all this. He gestured vaguely at the opulent room. My wife, Eleanor, she was the soul. I was the science, and the science of this particular product is fascinating. He began to walk slowly toward the office, his footsteps the only sound in the room. Phenylacetylurea, an interesting choice, not overtly toxic on its own, but its breakdown products under enzymatic hydrolysis. Well, you know better than I do. That's the point, isn't it? The slow, creeping damage, the tremors, the cognitive fog. Untraceable if you're not looking for it. Just the sad, inevitable decay of old age. You were always good with data, Marcus, even when you were faking it. The blood drained from Thorne's face. This wasn't a random visit. This was an execution. I don't know what you're talking about. That's an absurd accusation. Arthur stopped just outside the office door. Is it? Let me tell you what I know. I know you were fired from Genentech for falsifying Phase 2 trial data on an Alzheimer's drug. I know you have $300,000 in unsecured debt. I know you've been sourcing precursor chemicals through a shell corporation registered in Wilmington, shipping them to a private lab in Queens, and having the final product delivered here, labeled as artisanal olive oil. You see, when you build an empire like mine, you learn that everything leaves a trail. Money, chemicals, ambition. He took a final step, entering Thorne's personal space. And failure. Thorne's carefully constructed facade crumbled. The sneering superiority was replaced by the raw panic of a cornered rat. It was her, he spat, his voice cracking. The waitress, Ilara. She's the one with the chemistry background. She's been blackmailing me. She is the reason I am here, Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. That young woman, with a dying brother and the weight of the world on her shoulders, showed more scientific integrity in a single night than you have in your entire pathetic life. She kept a notebook. She observed. She formed a hypothesis. She took an impossible risk to protect strangers, while you, a man with every advantage, used your knowledge to harm them for sport. You are a disgrace to your profession, to this company, and to the very concept of human decency. Thorne finally broke. A strangled sob escaped his lips. They ruined me, he whimpered, sinking into his chair. You people, you titans, you sit in your towers and pass judgment. You blacklisted me. I was brilliant. Brilliance without ethics is just a more efficient way to create monsters, Arthur said, turning his back on the weeping man. He pulled out his phone. Evelyn. It's done. The side door opened, and two of Evelyn's plain-clothed agents entered, their movements swift and silent. They didn't read Thorne his rights. They didn't cuff him. This wasn't a matter for the police. Not yet. This was a corporate cleansing. They would escort him to a secure facility, where a team of Pembroke's lawyers would explain to him, in excruciating detail, the two paths that lay before him. A quiet lifetime in a private psychiatric facility, his name and crimes buried forever, or a very public trial that would expose him to the full, vengeful wrath of some of the most powerful men in the world. He would choose the silence. Arthur knew he would. As they led the broken man away, Arthur stood alone in the empty restaurant. The victory felt hollow, the silence profound. He had excised the cancer, but the body was still weak. He had avenged the crime, but he had not yet restored the soul. That was a different task entirely. Ilara spent the day in a state of suspended disbelief. The call had come early, a polite, professional woman informing her that Mr. Pembroke had been so impressed with her service that he was awarding her a bonus and a paid day off, effective immediately. A car had been sent. A room at the plaza had been booked for her. It was all so surreal, so disproportionate to the reality of her life, that she could only assume it was a prelude to being fired. She sat in the opulent hotel suite, a place more luxurious than any she had ever seen, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She pictured the old man, his kind, intelligent eyes. Had she misread him so completely? Was this some cruel, elaborate game? At sunset, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Arthur Pembroke. He was not wearing the armor of his morning confrontation, but a simple, elegant cashmere sweater. He looked tired, older, but the cold fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant calm. "Ilara," he said, his voice gentle. "May I come in?" She could only nod, her heart pounding. He walked to the window, looking out at the glittering tapestry of Central Park. "It's over," he said, without turning. "Marcus Thorne will never harm anyone again." The words hung in the air. Over. A simple word for the end of a nightmare that had consumed her every waking moment for months. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. "What? What did you do?" she whispered. "I reminded him that actions have consequences," Arthur said simply. He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with a profound respect. "Last night, you handed me a note. You could have asked for money. You could have used your knowledge to blackmail him yourself. You didn't. You pointed to the problem, and you asked for help. You acted with honor. My wife, Eleanor, she would have admired you greatly." He gestured to the small table in the center of the room. "Please, sit." On the table was a leather-bound folio. He opened it. It was a series of documents. The first was a charter establishing a lifetime medical trust for Leo Thorne, fully funded by Pembroke Industries. It guaranteed him access to the best doctors, the most advanced treatments, anywhere in the world, for the rest of his life. Ilara stared at the paper, the black ink blurring through the tears that streamed down her face. The crushing weight she had carried on her shoulders for 5 years, the suffocating fear that had been her constant companion, simply dissolved. The feeling was so total, so alien, she felt light enough to float away. "But that's not why I'm here," Arthur continued softly, pushing another document toward her. "This is." It was the charter for a new entity within his company, the Eleanor Pembroke Foundation for Ethical Research. Its mandate was radical, to provide independent, absolute oversight on all Pembroke clinical trials, with the power to investigate and veto any project on ethical grounds. It was to be the company's conscience, codified and empowered. "A conscience is not a committee, Ilara. It's a person," Arthur said. "It's a voice in the room that asks the hard questions. It requires intelligence, integrity, and a certain chemical precision of thought." He smiled faintly. "I'm offering you the first fellowship of the Foundation, full tuition to complete your doctorate in chemistry and pharmacology at any university you choose. A generous stipend, so you need never worry about money again. All we ask in return is that when you are finished, you bring your mind and your conscience to us. You will not be a cog in a machine. You will be its soul. You will answer to no one but me." Elara looked from the documents to the man's face. She saw no pity there, only expectation. He was not giving her a gift. He was making an offer, a contract based on merit. He was treating her not as a victim to be saved, but as a colleague to be recruited. In that moment, the last vestiges of fear fell away, replaced by a dawning sense of her own power, a power she had forgotten she possessed. "Columbia," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion, but steady. "I want to finish what I started. At Columbia." Arthur Pembroke's smile was genuine now, reaching his eyes for the first time. "An excellent choice," he said. "Welcome to the company, Dr. Thorne. Or rather, future Dr. Thorne." 3 months later, Arthur stood by a sunlit window in the new pediatric oncology wing of Mount Sinai, a wing his latest donation had just completed. In a private room, Leo was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even for the first time in years. The experimental treatment, now fully funded and managed by Pembroke's top researchers, was working miracles. The door opened and Elara walked in. The change was breathtaking. The haunted exhaustion was gone, replaced by the vibrant energy of intellectual engagement. She wore jeans and a university sweatshirt, a stack of textbooks under her arm. The shadows under her eyes had vanished, and the eyes themselves sparkled with a fierce, focused light. She was no longer a survivor. She was a scientist. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Leo sleep. "He argued with his nurse today about the molecular structure of his IV solution," Elara said, a laugh in her voice. "He's getting his fight back." "That's good to hear," Arthur said warmly. "And your organic chemistry seminar?" "Professor Davies is a tyrant," she said with a grin. "It's wonderful. I feel like my brain is finally waking up." She looked at him, her expression turning serious. "I still can't believe it sometimes, that any of this is real." "It's the most real thing I've done in years," Arthur confessed, his gaze drifting out the window. "For a long time, I thought my legacy was about preserving what Eleanor and I had built. A monument of steel and glass and stock points. I was wrong." He turned his gaze back to her, to the brilliant young mind he had almost missed. "Legacy isn't a monument you build. It's a garden you tend. It's about finding the best seeds and giving them a place to grow." He had come to New York a ghost, searching for the soul of his company. He had found it in the most unlikely of places, at a forgotten table, in the quiet courage of a young woman who saw the world with unflinching clarity. He hadn't just saved his company, he had saved himself. And in the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping boy and the bright, limitless future of his sister, Arthur Pembroke finally understood the true weight of his fortune, not as a burden to be carried, but as a tool to build a better world, one life, one brilliant mind at a time. The soul of Pembroke Industries was safe. It was just getting started.